Fair City, New York vs. the Mafia is a 2020 2.5 hour long or so documentary split into 3 episodes. It follows the FBI's efforts in taking down Italian-American organized crime in New York during the 1970s and 1980s, a turbulent time for the city in which murder, crime and corruption were rampant. Mobsters themselves labelled the time period as the golden age of the mob. It more or less starts with a brief background as to what was going on and why the law was so far behind the mob, in that they were a lot more disorganized than organized crime, and witnesses and the arrests of low-level mobsters and associates proved to be ineffective in the fight against the mob because in reality they were not the higher-ups, they were low-level guys whose incarcerations didn't really mean anything. The big boys, the bosses, were still on the loose and living lucrative lives. So they turn to wiretaps, and we get a few little interesting anecdotes and stories of the cops planting wiretaps in the cars of mobsters, the homes and the restaurants they frequented. And those little stories are really interesting. One including some gangsters sitting in a restaurant and then the cops driving up to the window in their van, blocking the mobsters' view to their car, and then the feds get to work planting the wiretap right in front of the mobsters who can't even see. We get a few snippets of discussion that were captured on recordings, but a frustratingly little amount though, in my opinion, and very few from the mobsters that audiences will be most interested in. Anyway, the show goes from there to look back on what the feds found on the wiretaps from notable criminal figures such as Paul Castellano and Fat Tony Salerno, how they built cases against these men, and how they discovered that the influence of the mafia was so huge it had infected the construction business and the Teamsters labor union, and how the feds utilized the little-known RICO law to implicate top-level gangsters in crimes committed by ones lower in the food chain by bringing evidence that they are part of a hierarchical business structure or a family. You hear a lot about the 5 New York families in this documentary, but really they only follow 2 or 3 in considerable depth. The Bonanno crime family is almost completely forgotten, and it climaxes with a look at the Mafia Commission Trial, in which 11 organized crime figures, including people right at the top such as Anthony Salerno, Carmine Persico, Anthony Corallo, and Philip Rastelli. The legendary trial struck a huge blow for the Commission, the governing body of the Mafia, and many share the sentiment, including mobsters, that the Mafia never reached the same heights since. The documentary has a nice pace to it. It interchanges between archive footage, FBI snapshots, modern-day interviews, and similitude images very frequently to keep it fresh and sharp. Sometimes it goes a bit too far though with the style, slow-mo shots and things which could have instead utilized time to give us actual information, actual interviews. There are interviews with notable characters, like it was really interesting to see the guy who invented the RICO law, as it was to see Fat Tony Salerno's defense lawyer in an interview telling us how things went down from his point of view during the Mafia Commission Trial. This was a good documentary. It was interesting and informative, but I think it's made for laymen's. It's made for the average person who has a mild interest in the mob and wants to know a bit more about the heyday of the 1970s and 80s. I think mob fanatics who have a greater level of knowledge about organised crime will probably find they already know much of what was covered in the documentary, that they didn't learn anything new. In fact, some might feel frustrated that the documentary chooses to be limited in its scope and detail. After all, there are only 3 episodes, so there's only so much that can be covered. But also the omissions of many details. For example, the documentary repeatedly names Fat Tony Salerno as the boss of the Genovese crime family, and though he was an incredibly powerful man, which was the narrative at the time of the trial as well, subsequent details have revealed that he wasn't actually the boss of his family, but more of a front boss to take away attention from the real boss, Vincent Gigante. If I remember correctly, Gigante isn't even mentioned in the entire documentary, let alone being called the real boss of the family, which is all the more weirder because there's one really cool shot in the doc where they show all the 5 families in a big family tree, and at the top of the Genovese one they have a photo of Fat Tony but also Gigante, and in that scene they're talking about taking down the bosses of the 5 families and yet there's one photo at the top sitting there awkwardly that nobody's talking about. It's as if the feds got super hyped that they took down Uncle Junior, as opposed to Tony in The Sopranos. One thing I was disappointed about was that Fear City felt a bit disjointed and unstructured. It kind of jumps from case to case without cohesion, has huge gaps where many notable criminal figures aren't even talked about, and then tries to tie it all together awkwardly with the Mafia Commission Trial of the 1980s. There's some interesting segments, like when they follow the wiretapping of Castellano, his affair with his maid, him finding out that he's been tapped, and even his eventual murder. It makes me feel that it would have been better for them to choose one specific topic and stick with it, going into a lot of detail, rather than graze the tip of the iceberg with numerous cases. With the way the documentary is, which is it looking at the decade or so with these people at the top, as opposed to individual La Cosa Nostra stories, it probably should have been a bit longer, 10 episodes or something, to give it a bit more of a full feel. It also feels a bit conventional in an age where mafia documentaries have really evolved and moved on to a new level. For example, there's a few minutes worth of ex-mobster Michael Francese giving an interview in the documentary where he briefly touches upon a few things. But the thing is, we live in an age where a guy like Michael Francese and other former gangsters like Frank Culotta have their own YouTube channels where they go into far more in-depth accounts of the mob than in this documentary, where you can actually engage and talk to these killers and former gangsters. So when you compare something as extensive as Francese's YouTube channel to his part in Fear City, a documentary where everything he mentioned he has already spoken about and in more detail on his YouTube channel, the documentary comes off as a little pointless and unadventurous. Maybe it would have been an absolute baller if made 15 or 20 years ago. The omissions in detail are really quite staggering when you think about it. Stuff like Fat Tony getting 100 years in prison but the actual boss of the family being a free man, or the lack of information of the Bonanno crime family, who are said to have actually become more powerful after the commission trial because the other major families had to recover. I think the real reason is that it would make the outcome of the documentary less outstanding, if that makes sense. Like, the way the documentary ends, you'd think all the major mobsters were sent to prison, organised crime never recovered, and the law did a swell job and they should all pat themselves on the back, and we can all be happy that these pesky gangsters aren't around anymore. But if a more detailed and honest documentary was made, that would not be the conclusion. The Mafia Commission Trial was an albeit major victory for the Fed, but in a much larger and longer war. And creating a kind of hero vibe for Rudy Giuliani is pretty funny when you consider his friend Donald Trump did dealings with the mob, and has been subject to federal investigation himself. It's only after you've finished the entire thing, what with it lacking so much detail, that many segments come off as bizarre. Like, why did they feel the need to interview a random barber in the first episode? The only thing he really added in his 10-minute or so interview was that the mob was scary people to be around, which everyone knew before they even switched on the documentary. So much is made of the wiretapping, and they do give us a little bit of the actual footage, but then there's a lot of scenes where someone says, Castellano said this on a wiretap, or Fat Tony said that. Don't tell me they said that, let me hear it for myself. There's very little details on the lives and the crimes of the mobsters themselves, the ones that the documentary goes on about so much. I mean, I liked the duality of interviewing cops and criminals, but it felt like a missed opportunity because most of the mobsters interviewed had nothing to do with the event, and the content of the interviews is boring. One female cop, for example, talks about how she was the one woman in the squad, or Francese says a few times, "Yeah, I knew Fat Tony. Yeah, I knew this guy. Yeah, I knew that guy." You know, it's kind of boring. It's entertaining, yeah. It's great if you want entry-level knowledge of the event. But for those who already know a thing or two about a thing or two, there isn't really much of note here.